cultural resistance groups work, if they're within sort of like a system that extends, you know, its legal arms all around, is there space that they still occupy that you just kind of see, or what happens?
Oh, you know, this is a very interesting point because I was focusing on those examples because that's the most common and also the most visible for. Because otherwise you got to go covert, and it's much harder historically to figure out what's going on, right? And it's also true that, you know, when one theory of the state is origins of the state. You know, there's a famous Wittgenstein's hydraulic hypothesis that states are running irrigation systems, and they sort of emerge from that. And people did studies of irrigation systems in places like that, discovered that actually the states weren't running them at all. Local people were. But so the new theory is why, when you have huge investment in irrigation works, the states emerge. It's because people can't run away. They've spent 20 years building irrigation works, and if somebody comes and pushes them around, otherwise they just leave. It's interesting, if you look at the history of different places across the ancient world, mostly exodus, as they like to call it, is the preferred method. But there's all, for example, in Mesopotamia, they normally ran away. In Greece, they often rose up. There you have revolutionary movements. In Rome, they had this fascinating combination, kind of halfway between the two, the sort of phenomenon of the defection of the plebs. You know about this? Nobody talks about it anymore. Basically, 3 times in Roman history, the entire plebeian population of Rome got in a camp outside the city and said, okay, that's it, we're moving to another city unless there's some structural reforms. And so, as I say, you know, the history of mass movements is like not a new phenomenon. And, but the covert versions are interesting because we can't see them. The one fascinating example I find that I would love to know how it happened, but I don't know how you could, is the elimination of ancient slavery. You know, if you go to Rome around 300, ancient Italy, 300 AD, you know, 40% of the population are slaves. 200 years later, almost nobody was a slave. How did that happen? Maybe 300 years later. Well, you know, the story, we tell it as the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, or, you know, the beginning of the Dark Ages. It doesn't sound so great, but obviously if you were a slave, it was probably a rather positive thing. And the fascinating thing is we don't know. I mean, nobody was against slavery, but somehow it went away. So nobody on record is against slavery, because the sort of people who left records were the sort of people who wouldn't be against it. And the church clearly had something to do with it. But the church fathers are talking about dead all the time, but like only 1 or 2 are ever say anything bad about slavery. St. Patrick is sort of against it, a couple others. Patrick was a slave. So even though the church authorities are not against slavery, somehow through the movement of Christianization, which took the form of some kind of social movement, you know, there were major socioeconomic changes were affected. And there wasn't, you know, these world religions, again, were movements. And if you look at the origins of a lot of even philosophies were basically social movements. They came with their, you know, diet and meditation and practice. And so people were like, well, whether in ancient Rome, you know, you were a Stoic or you're an Epicurean or you're a Cynic, and these were like factions and groups that had philosophy, so they were very much like movements. And if you look at the history of China, there were overtly anarchist movements. There were, I mean, almost all of the great philosophical movements were social movements in that sense. So how the grassroots organization actually operated and how they achieved social change is one of the great mysteries, because we don't have the records to see, but it was definitely going on. 1, 2.
How would you relate your ideas to Marcuse's idea of the Great Refusal?
I'm not sure. Should I? Tell me more.
Well, he also said the basis for social change was more negative reaction against something rather than positive development towards something.
Yeah, I mean, I want to set it up as a back and forth, because, I mean, I'm actually a little critical of people who just focus on the rejection. I love Jim Scott, but I think that, as I say, it's a bit one-dimensional to just imagine people's entire lives being about not being governed by the state. You know, there's positive values that people are trying to realize in the course of their existence. But I think that in terms of the you can learn a lot simply by looking at that one aspect of it as creating sort of larger frameworks in which, a heroic society isn't just a rejection of commercial and bureaucratic civilization, but it is that. It creates a system of values autonomous to itself, in part in rejection to that. And then an anti-heroic society does the same thing, but in the other direction. So I think that we need to think more about the fact that people knew all about each other, were in contact with each other, and were constantly defining themselves against one another. But we shouldn't lose ourselves into the idea that everything was just reactive.
I was thinking, as you were speaking, about when social movements, what you were talking about throughout earlier history, they actually moved themselves out and actually occupied other areas and lived there. And what's happening today, my question is, do you think the physical occupations that have propped up are more symbolic? And is it possible that the actual occupation is more in the technology realm through social media?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it's a lot harder. It really helps when population is thin and there are uninhabited islands you can go to. Or alternately, spaces outside the city where you can run away to. We don't have a lot of that, and it's also much more of a long-term strategy. I think that it's really interesting to look at the idea that we're seeing in the Occupy movement of the creation of new communities as its inherently revolutionary act. Because normally, that is the approach that you take if you're running away to some small town. If you're Saint-Simonian or something like that in the 19th century, America still had little enclaves where you could set up utopian community, and here you have to, in a way, it's like a fascinating act of revolutionary defiance to do it like right in somebody's face, even though you really can't. But it's true, like to actually occupy anything, create a dual power situation, which is the idea, you have to like use every conceivable available dimension, many of which are in fact electronic.
Do you have a definition of art or a definition of an artist?
No, not really, no. I mean, I could talk about art, but definition, I like to look at art in its pre-definitional stage.
I guess in terms of thinking of culture as sediments of past civilization, arts and culture are linked. So just maybe developing on that.
That would be an interesting direction, yeah, it's worth thinking about. I remember having this long debate about the notion of art where I'm sort of facing the history of the concept. It's a Roman concept, I think. Pliny has a whole section on art. It's the first person to talk about it as a concept unto itself. But I mean, one of the fascinating ideas is when art becomes disembedded from life at all. And of course, then you have like generation on generation on generation of people trying to figure out a way to plug it back again. But I mean, for me, I think that what art has become more and more has been this sort of battlefield for both experimenting and like arguing about the definition of value itself. So it almost becomes that kind of experimental zone that all those little archipelago societies could be conceived of as having been in the past. So one connection. Well, you're number 2 and 3.
To bring it back to occupying again.
Okay.
One of the things I'm really drawn to, but also frustrated by, and I think your talk is sort of stimulated my thinking in this terms, is that it's almost like there's a lot of the energy and the resistance comes through language. In other words, people say, I'm occupying this, right?
You're not doing anything that different than what you do normally when sitting in the park, but if you say you're doing it while occupying, it makes it, they hit you.
Yes. In this sort of model of resistance where people say, I'm going to leave, right? That's one way to do it. But is it also sometimes to say, I'm a different kind of person in terms of how I name myself, how I linguistically structure myself. Like in Ireland, for example, to speak Irish for a long time was a real act of rebellion, and there's still some people who cling to that, not many, but some do. Is what is going on in Occupy something like that, where we construct a language and that makes us different, and we kind of, do it that way? So
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, is it an attempt to create, I mean, in a way, what Occupy is deeply ambivalent, because on the one hand, it's attempting to create a sort of insurgent democratic culture, which is radically different than the way we do things in our sort of everyday organizational life in other contexts, and thus designed, it's designed for the juxtaposition. I mean, not designed, but, part of the whole point is that, once you've actually been to a meeting where the guy running the meeting isn't also making all the proposals, for example. And then you go back to your job and you say, well, wait a minute, what's going on? Go back to a traditional activist group. So it's again, it's this fascinating juxtaposition where you're doing that classic work of creating an alternative culture, but you're doing it right in the middle of the very quintessence of the thing you're defining yourself against. You had 1, 2, 3.
Just kind of bringing together some of the thought of there's nowhere else to, to retreat to. There's no, if we want to be like a defector society. I feel like the next step for what a lot of people are thinking of is debt strike. And
oh yeah.
for one, I'm thinking like student debt strike, and I've been working with a group of people trying to think of a way to pull it off in which, you don't want to be the only one leaving the factory floor for the strike. And I mean, there's ways to do that, but I guess my question to you would be, what type of backlash and reaction, and what type of, what do you think that would look like in the general public, or, how do you think that would play out, or if it became a likely possibility, if we really started to see it, do you think?
The debt strike?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I wrote a whole book to answer that, right? So it would be hard for me to address briefly. But I think that there is a certain really deeply embedded morality around debt which gets evoked in contexts like that. And the question is, how do you head that off? And there's an obvious way you should be able to head it off, because one thing that is true throughout world history, pretty much consistently, is that there's different types of debts are treated morally totally differently. So that debts between equals, whether like two rich people or two poor people, are just always assumed to be there to be renegotiated and readjusted as people's conditions change. I mean, the wealthy, as we've learned with AIG, can be incredibly forgiving and understanding and reasonable when dealing with other rich people. But it's just when they're dealing with you that suddenly it becomes a sacred obligation, and people treat it that way. And one thing I can't go over the whole argument, but I was trying to, well, why do people accept that? And it's partly because to answer back, you have to use that language of debt, or people do. When people say, like, you owe me, and it's very hard not to say, well, wait, who owes what to who, and end up using that language of debt and making debt seem even more like the essence of morality than it had before. I wrote a lot about that in the debt book, how you have almost all the world religions, which again are social movements, or basically anti-war movements in the beginning, start by saying, yes, morality is debt, except not really. But they always have to take the premise and then deconstruct it, because that seems to be the language you have to use to talk about politics. So how do we get away from that? I don't know, because I think the thing you just have to hammer away consistently, the fact that rich people don't have to pay their debts. They don't at all. It's amazing the way the business world works. Is it never fails to fascinate me how Well, one thing I was saying about an hour ago before the show is that one nice thing about academic life is they never like pretend they just forgot to pay you. If you're in the creative industries, they always do that. Like firms will always try to like just welch on their debts to see if they can get away with. There's whole classes of people, agents, certain types of lawyers who only exist because people, with money will always try to welch on their debts. Yet somehow people feel that there's a terrible moral problem when the downtrodden do the same. I'm not quite sure, but like I think that by heightening that paradox, the way I do it is simply by pointing. We need to hammer home that debt is just a promise, and it's not morally different than any other type of promise. I think that would be the key to go to. Promises between reasonable people will always be renegotiated when circumstances change. This is the example I always give. It might be helpful. Politics. Like in England, we had a case where the entire Liberal Democratic Party swore an oath that they would not raise student fees. They got elected and immediately said, "Ha ha, we're tripling them." And they said, "Why? Well, we owe all this money. We're in a terrible debt trap. We have to do it. We have no choice." But what they're basically saying is that a promise to bondholders is absolutely sacred. We will not renegotiate that in any way. It's inconceivable. Whereas a promise to the public, to voters, is made to be broken. Well, why do we accept that? That's the common sense we have to undermine. And if you think about it, like, if you ask, if you say, well, we should have debt cancellation, they'll say, well, nobody's going to lend. People, if they aren't sure they'll get their money back, they won't lend, and the economy will suffer. And it's like, yeah, and if people don't believe that the people that they vote for are going to do what they say, they won't vote, and democracy will suffer, and that's what happens. Nobody believes politicians will do what they say, nobody votes, and democracy suffers, but nobody ever sees that as a problem, right? So I think by pointing out those paradoxes is the way to sort of plow through the inevitable objection you're going to get. We already had some people on Slack, but I don't remember anymore. There was someone back there, and then over here.
Are there examples of financial elite voluntarily giving up their concentration of wealth without faced with violent confrontation?
It depends on how you define that. If you mean by violent confrontation, like uprising, yeah, there's people who've done it in the face of something short of like violent uprising, directly trying to kill them. People who just did it out of the goodness of their hearts, no. But there's a big zone in between there. Well, give up your wealth. There's a certain point where, you've got everything you need anyway. Charity has always existed, but it's not exactly giving up that part of your wealth which gives you the power. And I think that's what he was referring to. Okay, I'm just going to choose randomly. Sorry, I wanted to stack, but I just can't remember.
So you sort of started by talking about how the argument of this unwritten book is largely about how if we look back beyond 300 years, we see other models for social change, right? And I'm just curious if there are maybe 2 or 3 sort of greatest hit models that you might recommend that we would consider now that we are not aware of, that you've come across through your research.
Good God. Yeah, I hadn't gotten that far. That would be the conclusion. I think that the major takeaway that I got out of it so far has been the creation of the importance of that creation of that alternative culture. What they did in Madagascar, there's that moment of cultural synthesis where you have these heterogeneous populations sort of coming together. And that sort of idea of being Malagasy is incredibly politically powerful, and it means that people have set up states. But there's endless revolutions that have happened in Malagasy history too. So you go to some valley and say, oh yeah, we used to have aristocratic rule, but in 1650 they overthrew those guys. It's like, so you almost have this kind of cultural DNA planted there for rebelliousness. And it's by changing sort of common sense assumptions and the role of what we would consider art and cultural phenomena is critical there. So, for example, the long meeting problem. I remember reading some work of political anthropology about, and an essay on egalitarian societies in Papua New Guinea, and said, well, one of the things that have fascinated scholars of egalitarian societies in Papua New Guinea is they tend to be characterized by really long consensus meetings which never seem to come to a conclusion. It's like, oh my God, they've had thousands of years and they still haven't worked it out. So they give us some ideas of problems we're not going to solve, right? But they have solved some ways of confronting this problem of the long, boring meeting problem by not making the meetings boring. They make the meetings really funny. So there's all these elaborate forms of rhetoric and wordplay that people develop, which are just really entertaining, so people actually like going to meetings. So I think and that idea of, let's turn our myths into jokes, and things like that. I mean, I think that's really effective of politics, are ways of sort of embedding political messages in ways that not only become common sense, but become pleasurable in doing so. That was a big thing I took away from that.
The guy just asked you, in the back, just asked you if there could ever be, if there's ever been a group of people that have actually given up power, that ran a society or something to that effect. In fact, and you said that no, or individuals or whatever.
Individuals do all sorts of things.
Individuals do.
Saint Basil gave up his wealth.
Right. They abandon they'll abandon their class interests. Individuals do that. But as a matter of fact, if you look at the whole planet and the unbelievable disaster that we're embarked on and headed into, is actually the function of a state that is run by a class of people that are not going to give it up. And I think that everybody in this room has really the moral responsibility, and yourself included, to say, the clock is ticking, and are we going to actually take the responsibility for when the time comes and one could do this, and millions of people can't stand another day of this, are we going to lead a movement that could actually get rid of this state power and put into power a state that could actually liberate people and be emancipatory? And that, I was the one that passed out these 4 questions to David Graeber.
Okay, yeah, now I got it. I was about to say, I haven't seen you in Union Square recently, but okay. But
actually, I have been in Union Square, but in other places. But the point is that we do have a responsibility.
I know. I found it amusing that people wrote up these 4 questions for David Graeber, never gave it to me. So someone finally did. In terms of, I think you're well aware that I actually am involved in creating such a movement, just not in the form that you would particularly like. We could argue about that.
That's what I'm
But let me just say this. Yes, of course they're not going to give up power. Of course, there must be all sorts of pressure put on them. I myself...
No, we need to make revolution, not pressure put on it.
Pressure put on leads to revolution. Revolutions don't normally take the form of insurrection. If you look at history, that's one of the things you learn right away. Very rarely do they. Actual insurrectionary or guerrilla movements don't normally create revolutions, and revolutions, when they happen, aren't normally created by that. Sometimes they are. It certainly has happened, but that's when they happen to converge. So I don't think there's one answer to that, and I think we need to actually look seriously at the range of possibilities. We're not going to defeat the 101st Airborne Division militarily on the streets. Sorry, they're way tougher than us, and that's what they're good at. And the only way we're going to get to a revolutionary situation is when we get to the point where the 101st Airborne decides not to shoot. Particularly when we think they have nuclear bombs. If we think they're going to use every weapon at their disposal, then, that's a reason to think that, we shouldn't be having a revolution because they'll blow up the world. I think they won't. I think that people will balk at that point. But that's the revolutionary question for me, and that's why these kind of cultural, ideological questions are essential to it. How do we get to the point where when it really comes down to a point where the pressure has brought them to a breaking point, that they send in the guys to shoot us, they don't shoot. That's what I'm working on strategically.
You shouldn't forget that the 101st Airborne was sent in to let little black kids go to school.
Yeah.
There have been uses for the 101st Airborne, apart from.
Yeah. Yeah, but they're not going to be sent in to, like, shut down capitalism. Sorry. I just really don't think that. I mean, yeah. That means might do it, but they're not going to be sent in to do it.
They didn't do so well in Vietnam.
Yeah, but, like, I think the Viet Cong are way tougher than us, too. I mean, no, you can organize yourself to fight a guerrilla war, but I actually, like, in terms of levels of violence and nonviolence discussion, you want to go into that and just see my opinion of this. I kind of go with the guys in Oaxaca. I think they have the most interesting analysis and most penetrating analysis. It's not a moral question. It's not. It's an organizational question. Like, if you go either the route of pure Gandhian nonviolence or the route of armed insurrection or guerrilla warfare, you're going to create authoritarian structures which are going to all end up subverting anything you end up creating. It's that middle ground where you can actually. You have to think about what level of tactics will support actual democracy. But another discussion. Well, it's not entirely different. I mean, it has to do with the very questions we're asking here, where these are saying the same thing. They were not distinguishing their tactics and what they wanted to achieve.
So,
I'm sorry. I'll ask in the back next.
So when we think about Tahrir Square, there was a certain amount of the police not. You know, that some of what you're proposing happened.
Some of it, yeah. Well, the police shot, but the army came in, and there was a huge split between the army and police for various economic reasons. And also, I mean, yeah, we could go into this, but yeah, I mean, this is what we find, which is fascinating. There's a whole discussion of violence, nonviolence. You know, I mean, if you just look at how revolutions actually happen, you never find a situation where they're utterly, you know, Gandhian. You never find a situation where they simply all grab guns and, you know, and then win. It's always somewhere in between, and there's always some complex, you know, like what you see in Syria, where on the one hand you want to be nonviolent enough that it's obvious you're the good guys, so the guys set to shoot you won't, but then the guys who are set to shoot you, what do they do? You know, so there's endless ramifications and complications that happen. Yes?
How would you advise them to proceed for an effective movement and acknowledgement?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, where did it... most of that money ended up in China, didn't it? In my understanding, the gold ended up in India, but most of the silver ended up in China. It would be hard to get it back. They did find that temple in India recently that had like all that gold in it, like what was it, $36 billion worth of gold or something like that. They could give that. I mean, but what are you going to do in metal anyway? I mean, it's a fascinating question how one writes these historical wrongs at all. I kind of like the climate debt notion, you know, that pay it back in a different form. Yeah, I mean, but there's also the question of, and this is exactly the thing I describe in the debt book. I mean, when we're talking about third world debt, you know, the first thing you say is like, wait, who owes what to who? You guys owe us. You oppressed us for all these years. You owe us a debt. But all of a sudden, you're accepting the notion that moral relations and debts are the same thing. And one of the questions I asked in the book is that not ultimately even more pernicious, because you end up adopting this sort of financial logic as the essence of moral relations. Whereas, you know, so, I mean, I totally agree that insofar as one is acting within an economistic framework in order to be just, one needs to acknowledge debts of all sorts, and, you know, so a notion of debt to nature, climate debt between nations, or historical debt, or reparations for slavery, you know, you gotta accept that if you're going to accept the system, the morality that exists. But ultimately, I think we need to explode that morality entirely.
Yes, well, I mean, I just wanted to comment.
Okay.
Reparations for slavery is not about reparations for slavery, it's reparations for labor, first.
Mm-hmm. Ah, very good, yeah.
And any debt to a third world would be for resources taken, not an immorality. So
What's the morality of debt that says that you can financialize things?
right.
Yeah.
You can make that argument, but
Yeah.
let's commoditize it.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, as long as we're living in a commoditized system, I totally agree, sure. Right, but I ultimately don't want to be living in a commoditized system.
I arrived late. My real question was, I arrived late, so if you address this based on some things you said about Madagascar, I do apologize.
Okay.
Be that as it may, my question is, what do you do with the notion, the profound and utter arrogance of the Western mindset that if it hasn't considered it, it doesn't exist?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, how many hours have you got? Yeah, and there's not just that. There's the assumption that, like, there is, I mean, I've written extensively that the very notion of sort of Western civilization is a bogus concept. It's a little bit off.
Or an oxymoron.
Yeah. Well, that was Gandhi's line. Yeah. I mean, insofar, it's very fascinating if you look at the history of the concept of the West. Until around the time of World War I, in Europe at least, they talked about the West as America, which was a savage and too new place, and the East as the Orient, which was this old, decadent, too old place, and they were the happy medium. They didn't think they were the West. The idea of the West comes about when you have this assumption that North America and Europe are somehow the same place, which was basically created by American universities, the idea of Western civilization, after they won World War I, and suddenly they were involved in European politics. It wasn't, so Western civilization didn't even exist in anybody's mind in 1850. It wasn't a concept. It's hard for us to think outside it. So and it basically is kind of colonialist grabbing all the cookies. The civilization used to be a universal concept, which everybody has to different levels, and it's so it was the mission of Europe to civilize other people. But then they sort of tried to grab all the cookies of decolonization and say, no, so universal, so it's this notion of the truth which are universal but are also ours, It's a complete contradiction in terms. And the creepy thing about Western is that it's used in 5 different ways, which can't be consistent with one another. It's either used as a cultural tradition, or a literary tradition, or a political power thing, or it's a racial thing, like the bodies were those of Westerners, right? And there's a very suspicious degree to which they can't talk about the white race anymore, right? So they say Western civilization, so that only white people always seem to be Western somehow. Like if Haiti has a revolution in the name of Enlightenment values, that's not like a great moment in Western civilization. Why not? So I think it's like a really creepy concept, and we need to get rid of that.
I'm curious about this whole, I think the thesis of your talk here, which is about how to change the common sense assumptions via cultural tactics or strategies and so forth. And I'm just curious because on the one hand I have this curmudgeon-y skeptic saying these assumptions are, they're ruling essentially. It's the grid and, people respect that. I mean, just in the mainstream sense. But also kind of looking at it from, political science sort of perspective where, culture is seen as sort of suspect in terms of explaining political phenomena or, social change, revolutions, and so forth. So, I'm just I'm curious about how to kind of reconcile.
Okay, well, I'm a student of Marshall Solon, so I can show you where I'm coming from. So, rational choice theory is the quintessence of a certain cultural tradition, which is a cosmological idea of what humans are basically about, not shared by the vast majority of people on Earth for a reason. The very notion of self-interest, they only concocted that in the 1700s, nobody in history thought there was such a thing before that. They assumed that human motivations were more complicated, and that sometimes, people are doing things because they like somebody or because they hate somebody, or because, not just because of self-interest, which is a pure abstraction that doesn't really exist. So I think that those models which, sort of relegate culture to a secondary dimension, are themselves very elaborate cultural constructs, which are sort of instruments of rule in a certain way. That's
my way of understanding it is it's trying to avoid essentializing peoples, right?
Right. Yes, but it ends up essentializing a particular cultural just by denying that's what it's doing. So, you can take those assumptions about human motivations and, the idea that people were constantly trying to maximize amongst scarce resources, straight back to St. Augustine as punishment for original sin through Hobbes. I mean, people have traced out these ideas and where they come from, and they're actually originally come from theological ideas. There's nothing particularly universal about them. I mean, they crop up in other places where you're a complex civilization. Almost anything you can think of, somebody's going to have said it. So, you can find those ideas in China in the Warring States period, and then people say, no, that's ridiculous, and they go to something else. So they end up choosing a different set. But I think that is important. That's the way you get away from essentializing. You realize that there's millions of options floating around at different times. And that's what I was trying to get at in the talk, is that politics is at play, but politics operates through the medium of fundamental cosmological assumptions about what life is all about.
I have a question of an anthropological sort. I wonder, in those classical articles that we were all raised in the discipline of anthropology, sort of the Solons in Service, the original egalitarian societies, all of that literature, there seemed to be a utilization and a mobilization of the notion of affluence to describe it, right? The name of the essay is the original affluent society, or there's a notion of affluence there. And I wonder if that notion of affluence, if that has any valence or any application to any kind of utopia that you yourself, as an activist, as a theoretician, as a political person, can imagine in the 21st century and beyond within kind of social alternatives. Where is affluence redefinable in the way that Marshall Solons and that generation of anthropologists kind of used it to make a point then?
Yeah.
Is it of any utility to you now?
Okay, this actually continues from the other question, because Solons, when he threw that out, I mean, he was being provocative, and he was making a very, and he was rather shocked by the sort of utopian way that it was adopted, because what he was really trying to say is a point that he's made throughout his career. It's really a very simple point to base a career on, but it's just, it's worthy that someone should make it, which is that, the entire notion that we live in a world of scarcity is based on an assumption that we have infinite needs, but we don't. And scarcity exists in relation to rapaciousness, basically, and people who are rapacious like that have to be produced. In a way, I'm extending that in the Dead book by talking about the actual concrete mechanisms by which people are turned into utilitarian maximizers, usually zeroing interest payments. Like the conquistadors and people like that were totally in hock for their whole lives. It's like the aspect of conquistadors nobody talks about. They're all totally in debt. That's why they acted like that. People don't normally act like that. So that's, I think, the lasting kernel in there. And he's developed that theme in a million different ways, but that's the sort of moral center. The argument about the hunter-gatherers got caught up on what has now turned out to be rather antiquated ethnography, which assumes that these refugee populations are typical, and got turned into this rather romantic primitivist stuff. And what I'm trying to do is to build on that by saying that just because these groups aren't primordial doesn't mean that they're not politically important. In fact, it makes them more politically important. It means, it's not like there is this lost utopian paradise. It's people self-consciously thought about this. Mature adults like ourselves who happened to live 3,000 years ago, sat around and thought about this and came up with some ideas. Like, why don't we create these small egalitarian circles, or why don't we create, these kind of structures to prevent hierarchies from emerging? It's not because that's what humans were sort of originally like, but it was actually, part of a give and take of politics, which we're still engaged in today. So that would be my answer. I mean, that creation of those sorts of societies of abundance has happened before by, exactly doing that sort of thing, treating the kind of behavior we think of as normal as pathological, and vice versa. I always like to give the example of the 7 deadly sins. That is to say, people say, well, greed is a natural human proclivity, you can't get rid of greed. And yeah, that's true, but so is sloth. So is pride and envy, and all of these things are things that you're not going to get rid of entirely. That doesn't mean we have to base our civilization on them. Like we decided to base ours on greed, other people went for sloth. I mean, who's better off? Yeah. Okay. On that note, I'm going to take a rest. Okay, one more. What do we got? Okay.
I have a solution to the student debt problem.
Okay.
If you lend somebody money, some people cleverly take out insurance on the possibility they don't lend it back to you.
Oh, let's securitize them, yeah.
Why not
Okay.
pass a bill that everybody has to take out student debt insurance even if they don't have student debt?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
So that those people who don't end up paying the student debt, it's not a huge financial problem. There's enough insurance out there. That's a capitalist solution.
You talk to that guy. See how that works out.
Insurers never pay out.
No, it's part of the morality of the debt. There's a possibility they won't pay you back, so you should have a plan B in case people don't repay your debt.
But it's very difficult to securitize a debt that you really can't default from. I mean, that's the whole point of student loans. Is that,
Well, if you change it so that you can default and there is insurance.
You try that, I'll see how it is. Okay.
Thank you so much. And there is wine courtesy of the Hemispheric Institute, so we can continue discussing afterwards, right there in the lobby. I just wanted to make 5 short announcements. Very short. The next lecture in this series is April 10th. It's a Tuesday, not a Thursday. It's by the first speaker, Ivan Marovich, who was one of the leaders of Otpor that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. And he went on to counsel, they founded a group that counseled many revolutionaries around the world, including the Egyptians who overthrew Mubarak. And right after September 17th, he spoke on September 22nd, and we took him to Occupy Wall Street, and he gave us advice. And he'll be coming back April 10th, so it'll be interesting to hear his perspective on what's happened. Then April 12th is the next one. Brittany Farmer, who's organizing a religion and revolution panel with various religious figures. Tomorrow, 2 to 5 p.m. here is Creative Activism and Digital Technologies panel. That'll be very interesting, 2 to 5. Saturday, 7 p.m., the Plus Brigades at Judson Church. Anybody look it up, Plus Brigades. OWS, clowning around, fun. And drinks in the lobby. That's the last announcement.